So my name is Lihlani Nelson, and I'm the Associate Director at the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems at Vermont Law School. And here at the Center for Ag and Food Systems, we work with partners and students and develop legal and policy tools and resources to build a more sustainable and just food system. So for today, I'm going to be focusing on pesticide exposure and how it's a serious health issue for farm workers, the compounded impacts of climate change, and I'll also talk a bit about some protections for farm workers, which are very much lacking. Hi, everybody. Um, just got bumped into a breakout room, so I'm going to have to figure out how to share my slides again. Okay. Okay, hi everybody. I guess I'll just start talking. I don't see Alexis or somebody else trying to speak. So I also don't know if what I was just saying, which felt like it was in a different room, was heard, but I'll start from my beginning here. So my name is Lihlani Nelson. I'm the Associate Director at the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems at Vermont Law School. And at CAFS, we work with partners and students across the country to develop legal and policy tools and resources to build a more sustainable and just food system. And some of our work is on farm workers and farm worker protections. So today I'll talk more about pesticide exposure, how it's a serious issue for farm workers, the compounded impacts of climate change, and also talk a little bit about protections for farm workers, which are very much lacking across the board. And just for a little bit of context, I was part of a group at CAFS where I work, and also the Johns Hopkins Center for Livable Future that wrote 2 reports recently on how policy protections are lacking for farm workers from pesticide exposure and heat-related illness. The report that Johns Hopkins did was more on public health impacts, and today I'm going to be referencing some of the research and findings from both of these reports in my presentation. All right. So here's an overview of this session today. First, I'm going to talk about pesticides as a workplace hazard for farm workers. Then I'll describe health impacts from pesticide exposure, and I'll discuss how climate change is impacting farm workers in terms of pesticide exposure and making it worse. And then I'll provide an overview of protections and end with some recommendations. So farm workers face many different workplace hazards. We heard a lot about this yesterday and in the introduction today. And some of these are unsanitary working conditions and living conditions, injury from heavy machinery. Sorry, I just saw a chat pop up in my thing. Repetitive motion, illnesses from zoonotic diseases, pesticides, which we're focusing on today, and heat exposure, which we'll hear about after this. And I'll talk a little bit about that too, because it relates to pesticides. So for migrant farm worker women, and women in particular, significant reproductive health issues also were common, and children who lack access and families that cannot afford health care face a lot of issues that are really difficult to get seen by medical professionals due to partly because of extraordinary low wages and rampant wage theft. So climate change has exacerbated many of the conditions and issues due to extreme heat and increased pesticide usage to combine the rising spread of pests due to climate change. And I'll go into that a little more in depth in just a little bit. First, I'm just going to talk about pesticides in this country. So agriculture in the US has become increasingly reliant on pesticides to control insects, fungi, weeds, and other organisms that may threaten crops. And there's about 1.1 billion pounds of pesticides applied annually. And farm workers are consistently exposed to these toxic chemicals. The term pesticides refers to a very broad range of chemicals, including over 1,000 active substances and 16,000 formulations, which include insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, and fumigants. And the level of each of those pesticides, as well as the risk to human health and the risk data, varies by the different pesticide types. And just for reference, in 2016, about 322 million pounds of agricultural pesticide use in the US. Those were pesticides that actually are banned in the EU. So we have a lot of pesticides that are used in our country that are more dangerous than those that are used in a lot of other countries. We have not banned as many as we should. So beyond the risks of mixing and applying pesticides, most pesticide exposure occurs when workers inadvertently have direct contact with pesticide residue, could be on crops, soil, drift, and nearby fields. In California, there are results from a pesticide illness surveillance program from 2017 that found that pesticide drift was associated with 51%, so that's over half of the illnesses and the cases reported for field workers, whereas residue contributed to 30%. So getting exposure through drift is extremely, extremely common, more so than being exposed directly to residue being applied. So farm workers are exposed through contact on their skin and through inhalation. And acute toxic exposure may also occur due to issues with labeling of pesticides and accidental spills and leakages, issues with equipment malfunctioning, and also difficulties with PPE. So even farm workers who are not working directly with pesticides, like I was just saying, are at risk of exposure, given that employers often do not post notices that certain fields have been sprayed or are cleared to re-enter after they've been sprayed. And there's very little enforcement of these re-entry periods. Farm workers and their families also live in agricultural communities and experience multiple exposures because of the pesticide residue that can also come into their homes, which can be brought in on the farm workers' clothing or from aerial drift. And children are especially vulnerable to these community exposures, which can disrupt their development and cause serious long-term health issues. So from an environmental justice perspective, farm workers and their families and communities are disproportionately exposed to pesticides as they're living like right next to or surrounded by these hazards. Next slide. So the health effects of pesticides can be categorized into acute and chronic. It's one way to think about it. And so acute is within 48 hours of exposure, and chronic health impacts occur months or years after the exposure to pesticides, and they're much harder to measure. Acute health outcomes include the things you can see listed here, including irritation and damage to nerves, skin and eyes, dizziness, blurred vision, headaches, muscle aches, nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, diarrhea, seizures, loss of consciousness, respiratory distress. And a lot of these symptoms can be confused with flu-like symptoms and often go misdiagnosed or underreported. And then chronic health outcomes include cancer, neurological effects, metabolical effects, respiratory issues, DNA damage, hormones and reproductive issues. And I added kidney disease or failure to this list because there's some new research showing that we're seeing those impacts as well. And farm workers do not have often access to health insurance and medical care and workers' compensation, which can make it really hard to seek medical care from being exposed to pesticides and experience illness from that. And so many or most cases are going underreported, which is why it's hard for me to come and give you data that says this number of farm workers have experienced illness due to pesticides exposure, because there really just isn't the data there. All right. There are inconsistent illness reporting requirements by state, and even with illness reporting requirements, such as those in California that may carry some penalties, illnesses from pesticide exposure are going largely underreported and unreported because workers fear retaliation, lost income, they may lack access to affordable medical care, And there's also a lack of county level worker protection law enforcement that contributes to this. So without a federal agency or department that's solely responsible for collecting pesticide illness reporting data, there's limited data, like I was just saying, showing the number of acute pesticide poisonings or injuries specific to farm workers in the US. Um, the National Poison Control Center has a hotline that you can call if you suspect you've been or somebody you work with has been exposed to pesticides and has been poisoned, but the data that they collect is not specific to farm workers. And every state has a different pesticide regulatory agency that has the responsibility to investigate pesticide incidences, looking into the misuse of pesticides and drift, et cetera. So aside from the issues of collecting the data, pesticide incidents and illnesses are largely unreported because farm workers can't always file a complaint or report an acute pesticide exposure anonymously. And again, they feel retaliation from their employer. And one thing that we've been really trying to figure out and think a lot about is how to make it easier for farm workers to report pesticide exposure or illness from and poisoning. And this is just something in the breakout sessions later or in the Miro board. Would love to hear as much from you all about ideas for trying to get that information because right now it's just not happening. So farm workers have an even more challenging job due to climate change with rising summer and winter temperatures and extreme weather patterns. It increases the likelihood that farm workers will be exposed to pesticides, and that compounds with the effects of heat stress. So increasing usage of pesticides is expected due to more pests and more diseases and more vigorous weeds on the farms, and the decrease in the efficiency and the efficacy of the pesticides as the temperatures rise. So these higher temperatures are increasing the movement of the pesticide fumes and the concentration of the pesticides in the air, which can increase the rate of those pesticides turning more toxic and becoming more dangerous for farm workers. So farm workers are given PPE or personal protective equipment and told to wear long layers and protect from exposure to pesticides, but wearing PPE puts farm workers even more at risk of heat stress. So wearing these multiple layers, according to this study that I think I added on the slide, this is crazy. Wearing the long sleeve and multiple layers may add up to 12 degrees to the feels like temperature, and wearing non-breathable coveralls while applying pesticides can increase the feels like temperature by up to 27 degrees. So just think about that in terms of climate change and what farm workers will be dealing with if they're trying to wear the protective equipment that's recommended. So research showing the heat stress also increases the body's susceptibility to pesticides and other toxicants that also increases the risk of acute and chronic effects of the pesticides, how it already impacts your body. And there's a 2021 study that is showing that exposure to pesticides can worsen the effect that heat stress has on kidney function. Um, and yeah, so there's a lot that is going to be affecting farm workers in terms of climate change and pesticide exposure and illness. And despite these significant risks that are associated with their work, farm workers are excluded from many labor protections, as I heard in the introduction today. Somebody, Nina, was talking about that, and that's due to our nation's long history of food and agricultural system that's rooted in enslavement and not prioritizing the needs of these marginalized groups. Um, so what can be done to protect farm workers from pesticides? And a lot of what I'm going to share in the next few slides is from a policy perspective. That's just given the work that we do. I encourage you to read the report. I'll put a link in the chat after I'm done, or maybe somebody else can do that, but it has a lot more information than what I'm going to share now. But I just want to note that from the presentation yesterday, we also know there's like so many systems that need to be changed. So what I'm talking about here is like one piece of that puzzle, and specifically policy, but there are a lot of different big structural and systemic changes that need to be made to protect farm workers. So on this slide, you can see what's called the hierarchy of controls, and it's from the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. And this graphic shows the effectiveness of different types of approaches to protecting farm workers from the effects of a certain hazard. So in this case, we're talking about pesticides. So at the top, you can see the best protection is removing the hazard entirely, or elimination. This would be banning the most dangerous pesticides. And so the next one down, engineering controls, that would be keeping people away from the hazard, such as keeping workers out of fields that have been sprayed, for example. The next one is administrative controls, which involve policies or procedures that create a safer work environment. And the last one on the list is personal protective equipment, PPE. And you can see that's considered to be the least effective method of protection. And this framework, I think, is helpful to think about the ways that we can better protect farm workers. And as I'll talk about, unfortunately, there aren't the policy is not doing enough to protect farm workers, even considering this framework and trying to have laws that address these different things. And so in the US, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, and the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, are the two that administer and enforce the federal farm worker protections related to preventing pesticide exposure and heat-related illness. And the EPA sets the minimum standards for safe pesticide use, and OSHA regulates the general safety in the workplace. And states, they must incorporate those federal standards into their own worker protection laws and regulations at a bare minimum, while there are some states that include some higher standards that go above and beyond what's set at the federal level because they've realized the federal safeguards are failing in a lot of ways. And I will talk a little bit about those today. Um, so the EPA oversees federal pesticide regulation, and that's authorized under the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, which is called FIFRA. And FIFRA requires that all pesticides that are intended for use in the US have to be registered with the EPA. And FIFRA lays out a set of uniform standards for the nation, but gives the states, again, the authority to regulate the use of pesticides further. So after registration, pesticides may still be subject to labeling and packaging, storage, disposal, and transportation requirements as well. And so FIFRA requires applicants that are trying to get a pesticide approved to demonstrate that the pesticide will not generally cause unreasonable adverse effects on the environment. In determining whether an adverse effect is unreasonable, the EPA has to consider the pesticide's economic, social, and environmental risks and benefits to people. But EPA interprets this to mean it's not required to balance the risks and benefits for each exposed group individually, noting that a pesticide may present a high risk to workers, but those risks must be balanced against the economic benefit to society, which obviously that is not prioritizing the workers' health as number one. And so the EPA does not consider, they also don't consider chronic exposure to certain industries or risks to pregnant women or children or interactions between multiple pesticides when doing this initial risk assessment before approving pesticides. Okay. So the EPA developed the Agricultural Worker Protection Standard in 1974, and it was recently updated in 2015 and added further protections. And WPS, it aims to reduce pesticide poisonings through having pesticide safety training requirements and notification of the application of pesticides, the use of PPE, keeping workers out of fields after pesticides have been applied, um, and things like that. And states are responsible for implementing the WPS with the EPA providing oversight. But WPS is weaker than other occupational standards outside of agriculture, and the WPS is also poorly enforced. It also does not protect worker confidentiality when it comes to reporting a pesticide use violation, which further exacerbates the issues of underreporting due to farm workers, again, fear of retaliation if they can't report anonymously. So these standards and preventative measures, they really fail to address the power dynamics and the realities that farm workers are facing. For example, WPS requires proper use of PPE, but the regulations, they have weaknesses in regards to safety and actual protection of workers, given that the use of protective clothing, such as long sleeves and pants and boots, hats, gloves, and masks, that increases the risk of heat stress and illness by adding those extra layers of warm clothing. So one study asked farm workers about their perceptions of pesticide protective behaviors. Working on tobacco farms in North Carolina, and they found that once the clothing becomes wet with rainwater, dew, sweat, etc., it's no longer providing adequate protection and may actually increase the absorption of pesticides and nicotine. So these protective behaviors may actually be like implausible if they hinder the productivity and wages for those working for piece rate. For example, individuals, workers that are harvesting crops may not use gloves to protect their hands from pesticide residue because those gloves might slow down their work and they're trying to work, um, they get paid by piece rate. So yeah. The Occupational Safety and Health Act, known as OSHA Act, is supposed to make sure employers provide a safe workplace for these employees. And OSHA standards, they require employers adopt specific practices to ensure employee safety and safe workplaces. But many farms are actually exempt from this, including farming operations, which employ 10 or fewer employees and does not maintain a temporary labor camp. So according to the 2017 US Census of Ag, 93% of farms collectively employing 1.2 million workers meet these criteria, meaning that they're completely exempt from OSHA enforcement investigation, which is really problematic. So small farms are not exempted from enforcement by OSHA plans in California, Oregon, and Washington, where the agriculture and the injury rates are a little lower than other states. So states, like I said before, they must incorporate those federal standards into their own worker protection laws, um, and regulations at a minimum. But other states can include higher standards than those set at the federal level if they're wanting to go above and beyond. So here on the slide, you can see just types of laws that states can pass or have passed. And in the report that I mentioned, we have even more specific examples that you can reference. But some laws that states have passed include banning certain pesticides, controls on pesticide drift, restrictions on the use and application of pesticides, such as permits and licensing requirements, field re-entry intervals, requirements and record keeping and use reporting for pesticides, education and training for workers, labeling and language accessibility. And there are some states that have gone above and beyond, such as California and Washington and some others, that if you're interested in looking at your own state laws, our report, I think we have 13 states that we included. We couldn't look at every state in the country, but you can see um, a pretty comprehensive overview of the laws from those states as they relate to pesticide exposure and heat-related illness. All right, so prevention is really key in terms of preventing farm workers from pesticide exposure and heat stress. And we need to think on all levels and act on all levels. When I imagine that hierarchy of controls graphic, you can't just ban pesticides. You have to think about having policy that protect farm workers on all of those levels. Um, so the policy recommendations that I have here are ones that I hope you all think about and consider and maybe share with the groups that you work with. But I also would love to hear from others what they're seeing and what they hear from farm workers are needs and that we could include in a next report in our research, and look at how we can use policy to better protect farm workers. So some of the recommendations here include banning the most toxic pesticides, and also requiring pesticide labels to be printed in Spanish and ensure language accessibility for farm workers that also speak indigenous languages, which right now is not being considered. Also require that farmers notify neighboring farms, residencies, and schools before applying pesticides within a quarter-mile of property lines to prevent when the pesticide drifts over from where it's being sprayed. Also required that pesticide names, dates, and times are posted on the signs that are warning workers of the restricted interviews, um, and requiring employees to provide consistent, comprehensive, and accessible trainings on the dangers of pesticide and heat-related illness, in reporting and treatment and workers' rights. And on this recommendation, I actually just before the presentation today was looking to see other resources out there for some of you who might work in supporting farm workers and providing services. And there's a lot of English and Spanish training materials out there available for pesticide safety that we can share after this as well, if you're interested in that. Um, and so in states with high populations of farm workers, we also recommend that there be more funding to strengthen the existing migrant health centers that are out there to serve farm workers with medical professionals that are trained to identify and address the health issues that farm workers face, such as pesticide exposure, because a lot of doctors and medical professionals don't even know how to see what's happening and identify that as pesticide exposure and report it. Also replacing the OSHA guidance with an actual enforceable heat safety standard, which I bet we'll hear after the next session specifically about heat. So as I said, these are recommendations, and advocating for changes in your state and at the federal level are super important. We also know that there's a lot else that needs to be done and systems that need to change. And I know a lot of folks that are here are wondering what we can do about what we can do. There are a lot of questions like, what can we do next? So if you or your organization are working with farm workers who are exposed to pesticides, I would love to hear more from what groups are seeing and doing. If you're interested in sharing any of your experiences of those that you are representing or work with, or your own knowledge and experience, we're beginning to do some more research on this topic of pesticide exposure and farm worker health. So I would love to, hear from you as we're beginning to delve more into that research. But at this point, I hope I haven't gone too over my time allotment. I hope you enjoyed my talk. Please let me know if you have any questions. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Lihlani. So before we go into breakout rooms, we do have a few questions that came up in the chat. So Lihlani, if you want to come back on stage, if we can have her come back on stage. And then if you just want to respond to a few of these questions before we go into breakout rooms. So one question is about reproductive health issues and if they affect men as well as women related to pesticide exposure.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Hold on. I think I automatically disappeared. I think both, but I would have to look back at the research. I can get back to you, or the report that Johns Hopkins did on the public health impacts, I know has the specific research that they cited and saying that. So I'm sorry, I'm not like a scientific expert on this, but I think it probably affects both those women. The women, I think, are facing more challenges because, in terms of growing a child in your body and all of what women do yeah, in reproductive, sorry, I'm fumbling. I think women deal with it more, but I think there may be impacts on men as well, but you see more of it in women as like the primary people that bear children. So.
Another question is about distinguishing between pesticide exposure and nicotine poisoning in tobacco workers. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
That's super interesting. We did not, I personally did not see research on this. That's an interesting topic. I'm going to write that down and look into it. But in terms of the protections, I would think that it would be on the medical professional that would be seeing somebody who was poisoned or exposed. And I don't know if they would be able to tell the difference. Like, this is another one of those things where, like, if you're working on a tobacco farm and you're experiencing some of those acute symptoms, how do you know what is causing that? And this is where we need better training for medical professionals to be able to identify acute pesticide exposure and the illness that can come from that.
And then there was a question about organic produce and whether organic foods have pesticides.
So I don't think you're allowed to use pesticides on organic food. I would have to double check the USDA organic certification. I don't think that they allow pesticides. But I would check that. But you can always, when you're buying produce, if you're buying it at a local farm or from a place where you know it came from, you can always ask to get like all the way to the level of detail that you want to know, because I understand like organic at a store, you don't necessarily know where that came from and what was used in growing that. But yeah, I don't think that honestly, to me, that is one reason why I try to buy organic food as much as possible. It's less about, oh, I don't want to get sick myself, but I think about the farm workers that are growing the food that are exposed to pesticides. So that's one thing I wish we talked more about when it came to organic, and why it's important to buy organic food, is that you're buying food that is not based on a system relying on pesticides that are killing people and that are really hurting communities. But people don't talk as much about that. They talk about like the dirty dozen and I'm going to get sick, when it's more that people are dying because of the use of these chemicals.
Mhm.
Sorry, that's not necessarily answering your question, but